Byzantine music, and that's a very new word for it actually. It only came about really in the very end of the 19th century. It's what the Eastern Christian tradition has known for centuries as psalmodia, as psalmody, or sometimes also as ecclesiastical music or the psaltic art. So it's all of those things. It is a form of prayer and supplication and thanksgiving. And at the same time, it's also an art tradition, one with composers and a complex set of notation and ways of performing that notation. Well, today, the place of Byzantine music is one that's rather different than it was in the past. Before, people in local areas used it as their music, and they didn't think of it as anything other than our ecclesiastical music. We find 19th century writers still who talk about "I kathimas ecclesiastiki musiki," our ecclesiastical music. And really it's today where we have so many types of music available to us electronically, people move around the world, that then it becomes something very particular that we can associate with the traditions of Eastern Christian worship, but also more generally with a deep sense of tradition and particular times and places. Well, a festival like this, which is a wonderful event, it's been just a great joy being here, is something that can enrich and broaden the cultural and spiritual life of a city, bringing new perspectives on traditions which people know on a day-to-day basis. Again, you have a wonderful tradition here and many fine chanters. But also it helps set what is done locally within a broader historical, geographic, and cultural context. Well, the stroke of genius, I would say, is found in that basic spark of creativity that God has given to all of us, actually. I think it manifests itself in particular ways in the psaltic tradition, on the one hand in composers and hymnographers, people who have sat down and written out particular contributions from themselves and their own knowledge and background to the glory of God. But also it resides in every single person who chants that music. That because the music, if it sits in manuscripts, it's just ink on paper. And it's a living tradition. It's one that is transmitted from teacher to student, that people hear and they imbibe, especially in a place like Iași, where there's such a long history of this music. So I think it's both, I mean, fundamentally, it's that creativity that comes from God, but that also that expresses itself through time, which people can give to subsequent generations by creating compositions, and also through that individual act of singing and teaching. It's very interesting, the situation of Byzantine music in America, because it came originally to the United States and to Canada for that matter, with immigrants, people who brought their traditions of singing. There were a few expert singers who came with them, but most people who came, oftentimes they came from villages, they knew things only by ear, they maybe didn't read the psaltic notation. And so on the one hand you have a tradition of people having brought this over as a very practical type of thing, But what's happened in recent years is that on the one hand, young people within the church have become more interested in this music, just as they have in many parts of Europe as well. But also, what's happened too is that there's a wider interest in the general society for Byzantine music when they encounter it. We find Byzantine music now sometimes being used by modern composers, or it shows up sometimes in modern films. And for people who don't come from an Orthodox background, nowadays, with world music, and their ears have been opened to all sorts of things, it evokes for them, again, a deep, ancient tradition of something of calm and gathering the self, something that speaks to a deeper spirituality, whether they are able to explain it, but it can affect all sorts of people who have no background at all in the tradition. It depends, and on the type of music, but I'll just speak for who's people coming to our concerts. I have an ensemble that performs Byzantine music along with other types of Orthodox traditions, and some Western ones as well. And when we perform concerts of Byzantine music in Portland, Oregon, and Seattle, Washington, or at, I don't know, the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. or something, maybe only 10% of the audience is Orthodox. And that the rest of the people who come, they might be interested in early music. So there's a great interest now in early Western music, and sometimes we do concerts where we show some of the similarities and parallels between the old Roman chant, for example, the old ancient chant of the city of Rome, and that of New Rome, of Byzantium. So sometimes people are interested for historical reasons. Other people are interested because of its spirituality. Other people are interested because it's the music of other cultures. So actually, people come to it for different reasons, and their experiences, again, will be somewhat different. Sometimes some of the people, we give very full program notes. We always give the texts with our ensemble. And sometimes there are people studying very closely the texts and making sure they sort of catch everything. And other people, they just come and they close their eyes during the concert, and they just are having a spiritual experience of their own. So I think it speaks to different people in different ways. Well, Cappella Romana has had a long relationship from our very first concert with Byzantine music. And from that very first concert, 26 years ago now, we've tried to place it within a wider historical and cultural context. Because we spend also a lot of time doing contemporary music by composers like Michalis Adamis or Sir John Tavener, Father Ivan Moody, who draw on those traditions. So one of the things for us is not to view it as just a sort of a museum piece or Greek cultural heritage or anything like that, but to set it within that wider context. That being said, in Byzantine music, when we're talking about just the monophonic chant, just the single line of the melody with samison, we are basically doing sort of two things at once. We have done work working with churches to set music to, for example, to English. We had a joint project with the Archdiocese of Thyatira and Great Britain to set their translation of the Divine Liturgy in English to Byzantine chant, and we put the scores on the web in Psaltic and Western staff notation. So some things we do are educational and geared towards the pastoral side of things with the actual practice of the church. The other thing we do is we look at the historical past of the church, the liturgical past, things that people no longer sing. The concert we did here, for example, was part of a collaboration with Stanford University, where working together with art historians and also people involved in computer technology who are interested in the acoustics and the whole sensory experience of Byzantine worship. So studying the text, studying the architecture, the iconography, and the acoustics of those churches, and we bring to that the music that was sung in those buildings in the time, near to the time where they were constructed. And so there's a scientific side to what we do. There's liturgiology, understanding how people put together within the Orthodox tradition worship in the past. And also, by doing so, then we are allowed to share these things, which if we did them in a church service, people would find very strange. Or sometimes there are church services that don't exist anymore. The old cathedral rite of Hagia Sophia, the Asmatikia Koulouthia, had a completely different style of Vespers and morning prayer than we use today. So concerts and recordings allow us to look into the past and help inform us, certainly because in the Orthodox tradition we're always referring to the past. We are talking about this is the faith of the fathers. So it's just like other types of historical investigation in the fields of patristics or iconography that we help to provide some views of the soundscape of what worship was like in earlier times. I think what Orthodoxy can bring to the West by singing this music is the immediate experience of that sense of transcendence, which we find talked about in the liturgical commentaries, in church fathers going back to the very early years of Christianity. We have one of the ways that we have interpreted worship consistently within the Orthodox tradition is that the earthly worship is a kind of sounding icon of the heavenly liturgy. And so that's, I think, something also that people experience when they hear the music. It's one thing to read about it, but to have the immediate experience of this through time is something that, again, many cases, regardless of people's background, that they sense something sort of deep and profound in it. Some of it too, I think, is also we can bring an exploration of common roots in many cases, because those early traditions of the Church Fathers, the psalmody of the ancient great basilicas in places like Milan and Rome and Constantinople and Antioch, that there are common roots, and that it's something, again, that if we, by pointing out those connections, also it allows people to broaden their understanding of what Christianity is. Well, today in the Orthodox Church, that Byzantine music is one of many musical traditions. We can say it's the mother tradition in many ways, the root tradition. And there are also, even within that tradition of what people now today call Byzantine music, it's a tradition that there are variations in local places. I think one of the things about the Orthodox Church is that it has adapted, while keeping the wholeness of the faith, that it has adapted itself in various ways and times and places to local cultural circumstances. In Byzantium, we actually had a greater diversity of liturgical types. We had, in the same city of Constantinople, if you were there in the 10th century, you could go to Hagia Sophia and hear one type of service. You might go to a monastery where they were still doing the office of the sleepless monks, and another kind. You go down to Studios, and they're doing a version of the Rite of Jerusalem, which they were doing a slightly different version of it at the Imperial Palace. So I think we have a tradition of unity in diversity within the Orthodox tradition. Today, now that we basically all use the same types of services, there isn't as much diversity in the forms of worship as there were 1,000 years ago. Nevertheless, we have linguistic diversity as well, where music is one of those things actually that is tied very closely to language. And one of the wonderful things about Byzantine music in this part of the world, in Yash and Moldavia, and then going all the way down south to Lebanon, is that Byzantine music is very, very closely tied also to the type of music that people hear as folk music, which is speaks to the wholeness of culture, a culture where what you hear in church is an extension of what you do in normal life. And I think that's very important. And I think that some of the adaptations that have happened in other places over time, in Russia, for example, I think speak also to that same type of organic adaptation to local cultural circumstances. That being said, I think Byzantine music has a great importance as the mother tradition. I think it has a lot to teach people of any tradition, including non-Orthodox ones. But I think also that having that connection, that close connection between who you are as an individual, where you live in your language, and the music that you use in worship is also important. So I think it's a complex question. Not that means anything goes. I think that there are certain norms within the historical traditions, and that our liturgical services also require certain types and forms of music. But I do think that those can have different expressions, that the Church has blessed those through the centuries. And we today, though, actually find ourselves in a very unique position, whereas before we know from historical studies that until very recently, many people would not travel more than 50 kilometers away from when they were born. The vast majority of people, again, there were always some elite people who traveled a lot, and in certain parts of the world, I mean, take St. Paul. In that ancient world, he moved around a lot. But most people were very more closely tied to the land, and they would only hear the music that was being produced around them. Now also, we have the possibility, we put on our Spotify or whatever sort of streaming service or download service, we can hear anything from anywhere. So certainly Byzantine music, I think, has a role to play in those traditions, in those places where it is the local music, and I think it can inform other traditions and other people, as they have in places like Russia now. They're adopting it. But again, I think that the notion of the Holy Spirit working within the Church has shown us that different types of music can be blessed as well. Well, I think an educational program in Byzantine music is invaluable, especially today, now that we have, for the past century or so, or more in some parts of Europe, have had universal education, that education in music is a key part of that, especially in the modern world, where we're no longer listening to things, learning things completely by ear. And also that a school of music can help people enrich their knowledge and deepen their knowledge of the tradition, to learn not only some of the very simple things that they can memorize easily, but to go more deeply into the tradition. Well, Orthodoxy in the United States is a complex phenomenon. It's one where you have overlapping groups of people who came from Europe or the Middle East, and they came at different times as well. So each group has had its own experience, and that new waves of people from those from the Middle East or from Europe have also then brought sometimes different attitudes. The attitudes that people, say the Greeks who came before the 1920s, are different than the next set of Greeks who arrived, I have also experienced in Canada, than the ones who came in the 1950s and 60s. different attitudes actually towards music as well, because the musical culture had changed somewhat. There was the revival, beginning of the revival of Celtic music at that time. So that's why Canada has a lot more in the Greek Orthodox churches, relies primarily on chant, whereas in North America, rather is in the United States, where in the 1920s there was a lot of polyphonic singing in the churches of Athens, that you have Greek American choirs that have developed their own tradition of polyphony. So also you now have, especially in the past 30 years or so, increasing numbers of converts, people who've come to Orthodoxy from all sorts of backgrounds, some of them from evangelical Protestantism, people who started reading church history and realized, oh, this early church, it's still kind of around somehow. That's how they describe it. Other people who have come from Anglicanism, from the Episcopal Church, or other so-called mainline Protestant traditions, who look to Orthodoxy for a deeper sense of tradition. So it's actually a very complex phenomenon now, and there's a strong monastic movement in the United States, which there hadn't been for many years. So in many ways you have to look at it as in some ways not too different from some of the churches in Europe, in that there might be a broad spectrum of opinion isn't perhaps the right word, but of perspective, even within a single church, as there is, for example, in the Church of Greece, which there are a range of approaches and within that church, from very sort of conservative ones to ones that perhaps are more open in various ways to interchange with the modern society. And again, comparing that with Romania, that there is a difference when you have a kind of security in knowing that your tradition has been here for centuries, and you have the monuments, you have the physical evidence of this. You walk around, you see churches that have been here for centuries. So there's a kind of ease that sometimes, perhaps not everyone, but sometimes people in North America, that they might be a little bit more anxious about some things, about knowing where the boundaries of orthodoxy are in some ways, as they're trying to define themselves within that wider society. So I would say that each is complex in its own way, but that sometimes some of the issues that people are concerned about are slightly different.